Now, hi, it's Stuart Stevens. Thanks for joining us. This is a real treat for me because somebody whose work I really have admired for a long time. He's had a fascinating career. Patrick Strickland, who joins us from Greece, right, Patrick?
Yep, yeah, I'm joining you from Athens. Thank you.
So, congratulations on your new book.
Uh,
Want to tell us about it? How you started writing it, and how long it was in the works, and kind of what motivated you. I know you covered the border and written a great book, Mauraders. And what was the evolution to write this book? What sort of motivated you to dive into it?
Sure, yeah. Well, I had been reporting and living in the Middle East for about 5 years when in
Mm-hmm.
2015, what became known as the refugee crisis really began. And that year, nearly 1 million people crossed through Greece.
Right.
They were taking boats from Turkey. A lot of people were fleeing the war in Syria. And I just sort of, that's when I first started coming to Greece. So I had been, at that exact time, I was living in Qatar, working for Al Jazeera. And I came here to cover arrivals. And over time, I just kind of stuck with that. I eventually moved here a couple years later. And the book covers a period really about 9 years, about 2015 to 2024 of my own reporting, but the source, the material in there, like much of it
Mm-hmm.
spans back, decades. But yeah, so that's how I ended up here, and I stuck with the story because really after 2015, interest, in the press for stories on the refugee crisis kind of dried up, and I
It's
thought
just
that
like,
this
I
story.
mean, let's talk about that because there were all these tragic scenes that
Mhm.
of you know these people dying in boats and washed up on shore and trying. I mean, and then which is what happens in our world. It just those stories get old, but it still is happening, um,
Exactly.
and,
Yeah.
and gets and gets so much less coverage. Um, is it here in the U.S. we see a lot less coverage, but do you also see less coverage there in Greece? And
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So pretty much from early 2016 on, I would say that the amount of coverage that the refugee uh,
right,
arrivals got was quite a bit less. I mean, in 2016, borders started to close across the Balkans and parts of Europe, and so those people who had crossed through Greece in 2015, people now were, kind of marooned here and warehoused here, and so there was a buildup, and of course, even though attention went away, people were the war in Syria was still going on. There was all sorts of stuff from which people were still fleeing, and people were still coming and still come now. Just in December, I covered a story about arrivals in the last few months, and yeah, it's still a very important issue, and some years it still goes up quite a bit. Because of the way border enforcement has worked, it's a lot like the United States. It's less seen now as an issue, uh, but people are basically pushed into more dangerous routes, and so it's much more dangerous now. The actual act of crossing the Aegean Sea or crossing the land border into Greece from Turkey, they've
more
become.
dangerous now.
Yeah, yeah. In fact,
That's fascinating. Why is that? I don't understand.
well, it's a lot like in the United States where there was so much emphasis placed on border enforcement
Right.
that, in fact, what it did and deterrence, that what it did is it just pushed people into more dangerous corridors. So where somebody used to might take a boat with 20 people, maybe 4 nautical miles from Turkey to the closest island, that area is now heavily patrolled by Coast Guard and other border authorities like Frontex, the European Union's external border agency. And so now they'll try to do a longer route all the way around several islands. And of course, these are not safe boats. they're not made for those
Right.
kind of journeys. So people are pushed into much more dangerous situations, and you have shipwrecks because of that.
And how much can you just kind of paint the picture of sort of the totality of the numbers? Because I think it's really a hard thing to grasp that came in during this period. And was it largely being driven by what was happening in Syria? I mean, I've read these things where it's like the largest migration post World War II, refugee migration. Can you kind of fill in that picture?
Yeah, in 2015, it was nearly 1 million people that crossed through Greece.
I mean,
Very, very few of them stayed in Greece. I mean, most people wanted to continue onward to Germany or Sweden or wherever they could. A lot of times that was in Western Europe. Um,
right,
Many times that was simply because, for instance, one guy would say, I have an uncle in Germany, or I have family that they've already got asylum there, so of
right,
course people want to be close to people that they know. And in the years after that, Syria continued to be one of the main things. Syrians have like pretty consistently been in the top 3 nationalities that reach Greece every year, but there's other ones as well. I mean, there's folks that come from South Asia for economic reasons. I mean, there's always been a mixed flow of people, and it's like that in the United States as well. So you get that everywhere. But in 2015, yeah, I mean, Syria was the primary driver, I'd say. And then you also had instability, violence in Iraq and Afghanistan. So there were a lot of people coming from those places as well.
yeah.
Yeah.
And you read a lot about how this impacted German politics. Is there numbers about what percentage of these or ended up in being settling in Germany?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that, because over the years some people get returned to other countries, some people have to
Right,
go back to the first place of entry. For a while, the Dublin Agreement was suspended, and that's basically an agreement that the first country you enter is the one that you have to claim asylum in. So that number would probably change over time, because you have situations too where people got returned to Greece and then they went back. I mean, back to Germany, back to Sweden, wherever. But I think one of the big fears most people had was that chain deportations. There's always the risk that if
mhm,
you get deported to Turkey, Turkey has deported lots of Syrians over the years and lots of Afghans as
right.
well as Iranians. So, a deportation back to Greece, back to Turkey could then land you, in Syria during the time of Bashar al-Assad, or in Iran or in Afghanistan during the time that they're still fighting. So that was one of the big fears that people, expressed to me quite a bit over the years.
And Patrick, how has it impacted the politics of Greece and Europe? I mean, because I think it's really interesting, the parallels to the U.S., but most of us really don't know a lot about this, and you do.
Sure.
What have you seen?
Well,
Of,
in 2015, I first went to the island of Lesbos. It was one of the biggest islands. It was one of the ones that was most
right.
common for people to reach because it was very close to Turkey.
So it's
And
like
I
a
was
first stop, right? Yeah,
exactly, you reach Lesbos and then you continue on to the mainland, and then you continue your journey on wherever else you're going. Um, and at that time, I was just incredibly blown away by the amount of support I saw. I mean, I can remember standing on a beach in, November 2015, and you look to the left or the right, and you just see people everywhere, humanitarians from Greece, from all over Europe, Americans sometimes, people who are there to help people get off boats, basically, and that was an act that I thought was really important to document. Um,
mhm,
somebody wading out into the water to take
yeah.
somebody's child from them as they're trying to get off,
I
because
can
it's
remember
very
these
rocky.
these scenes. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. And so that to me was something that was, really inspiring and important. But when the borders closed and people were stuck here, some of that kind of started to wither away. And in Greece, you already had this history with a far right party called Golden Dawn. I mean, these are, self-avowed National Socialists. At various times they would admit to being neo-Nazis,
Right.
who had made it into the parliament 2 years earlier in 2013 for the first time. And, so you have this situation where there is a 7 to 8% of the population voting for a party that's anti-refugee, anti-migrant, and known for violence. So some people did encounter that along the way. And it had happened before as well with migrant workers who are here for, years, especially between 2010 and 2013, where there would be mobs of, Golden Dawn supporters and other far right parties. It was never just them who would attack and hunt down migrants in the city center here in Athens. It used to be on the news quite often. I mean, guys in masks, sometimes with knives, sometimes with sticks, and they would chase people down and attack them. So politically, that year, 2015, Golden Dawn became the third largest in the parliament, but they were already going through an existential crisis because they were on trial for violence years earlier.
What are the connections between the rise of the right in Germany? How much of that is being tied to immigration? I mean, from the outside, it seems to me a lot, but how do you?
I could have written this book in 20 different countries, to be honest with you.
Mm-hmm.
I could have written this book about the United States. I could have written it about Germany, and then I happened to write it about Greece because it was a place that
you kind of did with Mauraders. I mean, with the
right
in the United States.
Yeah, and it's because the talking points are the same. What happened, I think, in a lot of places was that this rhetoric that, is really focused on this word invasion has become so commonplace. It moved from the very dark fringes of the hardcore far right into a sort of mainstream right-wing parlance.
Right.
And of course, the word itself implies violence. I mean, if you say someone's invading us, then, when a lot of people hear that, they believe they have something to defend. In the case of Greece and many other places, these were people who were actually trying to flee war themselves. They had lived through it, for the most part. Most people I met didn't ever plan on staying here permanently. They didn't make that decision lightly. And I can remember someone telling me once, do you think that I would put my child in a boat like this if I didn't think it was the only way to keep them alive, to have a chance at a life? So, I would say that the parallels are, not just in Germany, the United States, and Greece, but kind of all over Western Europe. And really, the far right has kind of uniformly aligned on the way they talk about migration and borders. And this sort of anti-immigrant hysteria has become, sort of the mainstream.
Well, I mean, what strikes me as so tragic about this in the United States is uniquely we are a country of immigrants, and by definition. And, the evolution of this in our politics, I used to work for Republicans. And you go back to 1980, Reagan announced in front of the Statue of Liberty to send a signal of welcoming to immigrants. There actually is a piece of video you can find on YouTube that is sort of like from a time capsule, like something from another galaxy, of a 1980 primary, Republican primary debate in Texas, in Houston, I think, between George Bush and Ronald Reagan. And they're basically arguing in this very polite way who was more liberal on immigration.
Yes, my name's David Grossberg, and I'd like to know, do you think the children of illegal aliens should be allowed to attend Texas public schools free, or do you think that their parents should pay for their education?
Who are you addressing that to?
I think you're first in this.
He's looking right at you. I said he was. Look, I'd like to see something done about the illegal alien problem that would be so sensitive and so understanding about labor needs and human needs that that problem wouldn't come up. But today, if those people are here, I would reluctantly say I think they would get whatever it is that they're, what the society is giving to their neighbors. But the problem has to be solved. The problem has to be solved because as we have kind of made illegal some kinds of labor that I'd like to see legal, we're doing two things. We're creating a whole society of really honorable, decent, family-loving people that are in violation of the law, and secondly, we're exacerbating relations with Mexico. The answer to your question is much more fundamental than whether they attend Houston schools, it seems to me. I don't want to see a whole, if they're living here, I don't want to see a whole, thinking 6- and 8-year-old kids being made, one, totally uneducated and made to feel that they're living with outside the law. Let's address ourselves to the fundamentals. These are good people, strong people. Part of my family is a Mexican. Can I add to that? I think the time has come that the United States and our neighbors, particularly our neighbor to the south, should have a better understanding and a better relationship than we've ever had. And I think that we haven't been sensitive enough to our size and our power. They have a problem of 40 to 50% unemployment. Now, this cannot continue without the possibility arising, with regard to that other country that we talked about, of Cuba and what it is stirring up, of the possibility of trouble below the border, and we could have a very hostile and strange neighbor on our border. Rather than making them, or talking about putting up a fence, why don't we work out some recognition of our mutual problems, make it possible for them to come here legally with a work permit, and then while they're working and earning here, they pay taxes here. And when they want to go back, they can go back, and they can cross and open the border both ways by understanding their problems. This is the only safety valve right now they have with that unemployment that probably keeps the lid from blowing off down there. And I think we could have a fine relationship, and it would solve the problem you mentioned.
They each were trying to sort of get to the left of the other. You watch this and you think that, how did this happen? Reagan's last speech as president was an ode to immigrants. And that speech was focused on the point that you could move to France and you'll always be an American in France. You can move to other countries. But here, you could be a Frenchman who comes to the United States and you could become American, and the way you could be accepted. And I think one of the great horrors of what has happened to the Republican Party and just our politics is the way in which that has been corrupted, and just how sick it is. I mean, if you look at somebody like J.D. Vance and this idea that we're going to repeal birthright citizenship. I mean, J.D. Vance's father-in-law and mother-in-law were not legal U.S. citizens when their daughter was born. So that would mean, if that had been passed, J.D. Vance's wife would be illegal, his kids would be illegal. Mm-hmm. And that you can't, and J.D. Vance comes to Germany and campaigns for this far-right party that wouldn't accept his own family. Mm-hmm. And this sort of, darkness, I think, how do you see this developing? I mean, what have you seen in Europe, in Greece, Europe, elsewhere, that sort of foretells how this could play out in America?
Well, I think if, in the case of Greece, eventually the neo-Nazi party was stopped. But the state itself, I think, was
stopped because it lacked popular support. But
it was banned.
Was it stopped because it lacked popular support, or was it stopped because of increasing rules against hate speech, extremist movements?
Essentially, what happened was, after this wave of violence between 2010 and 2013, that culminated with a Golden Dawn member going and stabbing a left-wing Greek rapper named Pavlos Fyssas. Pavlos Fyssas died, and then eventually 68 members of the party were put on trial. That included the entire parliamentary group, so really high-ranking people in the party, including the founder, Michailo Liakos. So after a 5-year trial, the party itself was dubbed a criminal organization. It was given that designation, sort of like organized crime trial, and the criminal organization charge itself was like an enhancement. So through that trial runs all the other crimes. So that would include murder, that would include, hate speech, violence, weapons charges, all sorts of stuff. Probably some financial shadiness as well in there. I mean, there's a whole laundry list of charges in there. Right. So the party itself was banned. However, what happened, and several of its members are in prison now, including the founder and the former spokesperson. But what's happened is that since then, 3 new far-right parties that are very anti-immigrant have made it in the parliament, and what they've done is they've dropped a lot of the rhetoric. I mean, Golden Dawn actually had a symbol that was pretty much a swastika. And, the new parties have kind of learned from what Golden Dawn did. And they're not so involved in the street with street violence, but, their proposals on migration and border policy are pretty much the same. I mean, there's been talk of sending arrivals of refugees and migrants and asylum seekers to uninhabited islands. Now that like touches a very special place in Greek history, because under the military junta that ruled from 67 to 74, leftists and suspected leftists by the tens of thousands were exiled on islands and concentration camps. So I think, yeah, that the problem hasn't gone away at all. But the people who were at the forefront of it at one point are, now in prison. I think the big danger for everyone is that we become used to this kind of talk.
Right.
When you see it in the United States and you see the way it evolves, because every time there's an attack on immigrants in and of themselves, you can believe that what they're saying they're going to do to foreign-born people is what they also plan to do to you if you don't fall in line with their politics.
Yes.
And Trump himself has made that clear. He said, we're going to deport criminals. Actually, we're going to deport people whose speech might be a threat to our foreign policy. I'm not quite sure how speech is a threat to foreign policy, but okay. And then he said, well, we might send some American citizens to the prison in El Salvador.
Homegrown.
The homegrown, exactly. So I think it's always a warning for,
Yeah.
for domestic population as well.
A very depressing interpretation of this, which doesn't mean it's not accurate, would be that the United States had a similar moment when these January 6th so-called insurrectionists, domestic terrorists, were put on trial, convicted. Mm-hmm. And you could say we were headed in that direction, that would be accepted. And then Trump was elected, and now they've all been rewarded to the extent that he is seriously talking about how to compensate these people for the inconvenience they incurred while trying to overthrow the government of the United States. And it's become, if you look at this in sort of moral terms, you could say it was a moral test that Greece passed and Greece faced and maybe dealt with, trying to deal with at least. Mm-hmm. Whereas in America, we're going in the opposite direction. I don't know if you've ever seen, this last book I wrote, I finally made myself watch and read carefully Trump's announcement speech in Waco. And Waco, being from Texas. Mm-hmm. And it was, there at the 30th anniversary of the Branch Davidian tragedy. It was really a declaration of war against democracy and against the United States. It's when he first trotted out this language, or the most public way of running, I'll be your retribution, I'll be your revenge. And now we see this playing out. And I mean, how do you feel, it's maybe an unfair question, but how do you feel in sort of like on a hopeful scale about looking at America? I mean, how do you think this will play out?
Yeah, I'm always looking, like, especially in my work reporting, I'm always looking for the people who are pushing back in some way, small ways. In my first book, what I did was I profiled a bunch of people who are pushing back against the far right in different places. And one example of that, right? This was before, it was called Alerta Alerta, and this was in 2018. Oh, okay. And one of the people that I wrote a chapter about was a German pensioner. She was in her 70s, and she spent her time going around finding neo-Nazi graffiti or anti-Semitic graffiti and stickers, stuff like that, and defacing them, taking them down, scraping them off, painting over it, changing a swastika into a heart, things like that. So I've always thought, that it's important to highlight the things that everyday folks do to push back against this. And even in the United States, I have hope. I mean, it's a very grim time because you're up against a lot. And yeah, I mean, the Trump administration really wants to stifle even the most mild forms of criticism, it seems. But I don't think it'll be sustainable for them. And I don't think that most people want that, anywhere. Anywhere you go, there's always somebody pushing back against some kind of injustice, whatever it is in that place. And I think the same could be said of the United States. In Greece, that looked different probably than it'll look in the United States, but there was always pushback in the streets, protest. I've seen people quite literally put their bodies on the line so that, Syrian people weren't attacked by a mob, and I think it takes a little bit of that everywhere. And to be quite frank with you, I don't think the court I don't think this issue would have ever gone to the court in Greece had one, Golden Dawn not killed a Greek person,
Right.
and two, had there not been so much public outrage, because people saw that for 3 years, they were able to mob attack Pakistani workers, Afghans, whoever in city centers, and pretty much get away with it. And a lot of times even have complicity of the police. I mean, people didn't want to file a hate crimes report or an incident report or a complaint with the police, because then they might end up in a deportation cell, So what you're up against is big, what everyone's up against is big. But, I mean, Pablo Fisas' mom, after he was murdered, she could have been content with the fact that the man who killed her son was convicted and he's in prison and will be for a long time. But she's now made it a point to, speak out about the situation that refugees are still going through that doesn't get told anymore in the press, the violence that they experience, every day on the border. Sometimes this is boats being forced back into international water. And like I said, these are not very sturdy boats. So whenever you tow one back into international water, you put it in a really precarious situation.
Yeah, what it's really struck me about Texas, and there seemed to be a more hopeful future in Texas in many ways, because the more integration of unique, I mean, Tex-Mex culture. You had so many families that had like a Hispanic father-in-law, you'd marry, and it seemed to be a more positive picture of this. And there was less division politically. I mean, even Ted Cruz was getting 40% of Hispanics then. And there was, this certainly for George Bush was an effort of his to the degree. I mean, when I worked for Bush, the first thing I ever did was film the opening of a bridge between Mexico and the United States, which I remember because I was off shooting stuff and it was time to leave, and Bush, in very Bush way, I wasn't there. They just left me in Mexico, which, it was a lesson. And, call the people up in Austin and go like, I'm in Mexico. And they're like, that's okay. You can get here. People do it every day. You can find a way.
Yeah.
It's a good lesson not to miss the bus. But now that would be a wall.
Yeah.
And then the sort of political consensus, even like Rick Perry, had this line that if we get into the 20-foot wall building business, somebody's going to get into the 22-foot ladder building business, and now it's that there's no difference between Texas and Arizona. I mean, there's still that, or, the idea that in Florida, DeSantis is trying to make examples by importing from Texas to make an example of them. I just hope that it seems so out of the American mainstream that I just, particularly here, like on VE Day, when, there's graves all across Europe of Americans who died, Canadians died fighting that sort of fascism. Well, look, I don't want to keep you out there, but I'd love to just talk a little bit. You have a new book of fiction coming out that you're working on, right?
Yeah, I'm still working on it right now. It'll come out in 2027.
And these are short stories?
Short stories, yeah.
And
Yep.
okay, I love this title, You can kill each other after I leave. It's such a great
Yeah.
title and a
You want to
great
know
cover.
what that title comes from? Because that's a really
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah.
sure. So in 2018, because I think this is a really illustrative thing to think about also in the US context now. In 2018, in March 2018, a group of neo-Nazis took credit for, they phoned up the newspapers and they took credit for firebombing a community center for Afghan refugees. This was a place that helped Afghans file their asylum paperwork, stuff like that. People who didn't know Greek, it's a very complicated language, and didn't know how to navigate the country's bureaucracy. So they set it on fire. It destroyed the office completely. Nobody really could know how many files were lost. That's all, like people's evidence for their asylum cases. And then a few days later, Afghans and some local Greek solidarity activists did a small protest outside just to say, hey, we have the right to live without being in fear, And I was there. I had been covering this stuff now at that point for like 3 years. And there was a group of far right Greek guys from the neighborhood across the street started yelling. And I think they were a little drunk. They started yelling, we're not going to become Muslims. We're not going to become Afghan or Somali, and then just the typical stuff you hear in these situations. But it started to get very tense. And one of the refugees turned to a police officer who was dispatched there, I assume, to just make sure nothing went off, no problems, and said, make them stop, we're worried they're going to attack us. And the police officer looked at him dead in the eye, and I was standing right there. And he basically said, you can kill each other after I leave for all I care, but just wait until I'm gone. And it wasn't until very late in writing the book that came to me as like, that's what needed to be the title all along,
Yeah, and Sam, can you put the cover back up? I just want to ask a question about, is this the Golden Dawn?
That's the Golden Dawn flag.
Yeah. It
And
very much
that's the Greek, the Hellenized swastika.
Yeah.
Which sometimes they would admit, and sometimes they would say, no, that's an ancient Greek symbol. So,
yeah, we run into this with, somehow in America, we've had a discussion of Pete Hegseth's tattoos.
Yeah.
And whether or not he is, quoting the Crusaders or not. Well, listen, man, thanks for what you're doing. Is there a new nonfiction book that you're working on?
I'm just kind of in the research process. I'm kind of interested in.
That's a terrible question to ask anybody when they just had a book published. I mean, I've been there. It's like, I can't enjoy this. You're like already giving.
I think I wouldn't enjoy not working on something. I always got something in the background. So I'm wrapping up a manuscript of short stories that'll publish in 2027. And I'm kind of starting to look into stuff that relates to anti-war suppression in the lead up to World War I in Texas.
Interesting.
German communities, rural, farmers and stuff.
This
like
is
that.
isolationists. Do not get involved.
Some of them were. Some of them belonged to the Socialist Party. Some of them were Mennonites. Some of them were, all different walks of life. But a lot of people were, arrested for, not obliging to the draft or allegedly urging others not to. And newspapers were shut down en masse at the time. I think it was 75.
This is fascinating. I hope you write this. I don't know anything about it. Was this a lot in sort of, what we call Texas Hill Country now, where there's still a lot of German history, or German American?
A lot of it was, a lot of those folks were the descendants of like what's called the 48ers, the Germans who came after the 1848 uprising in Prussia. And a lot of them came with like very agrarian progressive politics. And, they had for the most part, opposed the draft during the Civil War, and then they did as well when World War I came around. But something that's really interesting is that, there was a period during World War I when a lot of these German towns had their names changed. So I was looking at one just yesterday, from Brandenburg to Old Glory. And then I was thinking that we really live in a loop, because the Gulf of America doesn't know how much it's a part of a really long history of pointless pointless things to do. So,
That's you got to write this book, man. This is
yeah, I hope so.
it would be fascinating, because we hear a lot about, not enough about, but particularly now, because of America First, of the period between the wars, of the rise of an isolationist fascist movement in America, Lindbergh, Henry Ford. But I don't think we really hear very much about this, as much, certainly, that angle of the German before World War I.
Yeah, we hear a lot about the deportations during the Red Scare, after the first Red Scare, in the wake of World War One, mostly in the cities. But I don't think you hear so much about what happened in the farming communities in the rural parts. And they were, there was a lot in Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico.
Well, that's great. I'd love to read that. Well, look, I won't keep you. Sam, can you put back up the cover? Everybody should read this and support Patrick's work. You have a Substack, right, Patrick?
No, I don't have a personal Substack. I work for an online magazine called Inkstick Media. So we cover war and the defense industry, all sorts of human rights related stuff. So it's just inkstickmedia.com, and we have a Substack through that as well.
Right, gotcha. So it's not yours specific. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.
Hope to do this again.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you.